Before we begin, take a moment, a deep breath. Let the noise around you fade, because what you are about to hear is not merely a religious reflection, not a pious tale, not an old story whispered through the centuries. It is a warning tied to a reality more terrifying than anything the human mind can imagine, a warning entrusted to a humble Polish nun whose spiritual experiences shook the church, the world, and the very foundations of human conscience. But today, this is not about the life of a saint, nor about mystical visions for the merely curious, nor about sensationalism or spiritual fear. Today is about you, about the dangerous spiritual tendencies of our times, about a kind of sin that has become so ordinary, so widely accepted, so socially justified, that people no longer even recognize it as sin. A sin that grips the soul quietly, slowly, subtly, and when the final moment arrives, it drags the soul downward with alarming speed, faster than any other. You will soon understand why Saint Faustina called it the sin that sends souls to hell quickly. But first, you must understand why this warning matters so deeply today, because the world has changed. Morality has shifted, human conscience has been dulled, and the sins that once shocked society are now called normal, healthy, liberating, or even necessary. And yet, none of these excuses, trends, or modern justifications, none of them alter the spiritual consequences that befall a soul when it freely chooses the one sin that shuts its heart against mercy. A sin that God can forgive. Yes, of course, but only if the person seeks forgiveness. And that, my friend, is where the danger lies, because this sin blinds, it deceives, it hardens, it convinces the sinner that nothing is wrong, that everything is justified, that repentance is unnecessary, until it's too late. And in the spiritual realm, in that final instant we will all face, too late becomes eternal. So today we will walk together through a deep, emotional, and brutally honest reflection. Not a theological dissertation, not a philosophical essay, but a journey into the most dangerous territory of the soul, a journey into the human heart when it refuses grace, a journey into the precise spiritual mechanism that makes this sin deadly, not because God is cruel, but because the human soul, little by little, shuts the very door to mercy. Saint Faustina warned about this sin not to condemn, not to frighten, but to awaken souls. And perhaps, just perhaps, this message has reached you today because your soul needed to hear it. Maybe someone you love is walking toward this spiritual cliff without realizing it. Maybe you yourself have been wrestling with this sin, justifying it, minimizing it, normalizing it. Or maybe you are simply curious, but curiosity will not protect a soul. Truth will, clarity will, awareness will, and this is why this message exists. So before we go deeper, before we reveal the sin that leads souls to damnation more swiftly than any other, before we explore why it happens and how to recognize it, I need you to prepare your heart. Put aside the thought that this message is for someone else, because no one, no believer, no skeptic, no devout person, no spiritual wanderer, no one is immune to the subtlety of this sin, not even the pious, not even the devout, especially not the complacent. And now, with that said, let us begin. To grasp the warning, we must first examine the nature of sin itself. Most people today think of sin as simply breaking a rule, a moral error, a mistake, something external, like violating a law. But spiritually, sin is far deeper. Sin is the voluntary distancing from God, who is the source of life, truth, and goodness, not because God withdraws from the sinner, but because the sinner turns away from God. Every sin, great or small, contains within it the seed of separation. a spiritual motion, a turning of the heart, a reorientation of desire. Yet not all sins are equal. Some sins are committed out of weakness, others out of ignorance, others in a moment of impulse. These sins wound the soul, but they do not necessarily kill it, because deep inside, the person still recognizes the truth, still senses that something is wrong, still feels the sting of conscience, still has enough sensitivity to say, "I messed up. I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry." Weakness is not the soul's most dangerous enemy. Blindness is, hardness is, stubbornness is. And here is where the sin Saint Faustina warned about becomes terrifying. Because this sin does not merely wound, it numbs. It does not merely lead astray, it blinds. It does not merely weaken, it hardens. It transforms the soul from someone who sins out of human fragility into someone who sins out of indifference. And indifference is death, because a person who no longer cares, no longer repents. A person who no longer repents, no longer seeks mercy. A person who no longer seeks mercy walks towards self-chosen spiritual ruin, not because God refuses forgiveness, but because the soul ceases to ask for it. This is why this sin is deadly. This is why it sends souls to hell quickly. Not because it is outwardly worse than other sins, but because it extinguishes the desire for salvation. It puts out the inner flame that whispers, "I need God, I need forgiveness." It shuts the door of the heart from the inside, and when death comes, when the final moment arrives, when the soul leaves the body, the heart's orientation remains fixed. Not because God rejects it, but because the soul refuses him. This is the terrifying spiritual mechanism behind the sin Saint Faustina described. And now we must name it. You might expect the answer to be one of the classic sins: murder, adultery, hatred, injustice, violence, blasphemy, abuse. And yes, these are grave, destructive, terrible sins. But the sin that sends souls to hell quickly is not simply the one that breaks a commandment. It is the one that kills repentance. And that sin is the sin of despair and presumption, the refusal of God's mercy. Let us speak plainly. Saint Faustina warned repeatedly that the sin which leads souls to damnation faster than any other is the sin of refusing God's mercy. This refusal appears in two forms: despair, "God cannot forgive me"; presumption, "I don't need forgiveness." Both lead to the same spiritual death, a hardened heart that no longer seeks mercy. This is the sin that condemns quickly, because you cannot be forgiven if you do not want forgiveness. You cannot receive mercy if your heart refuses mercy. You cannot be raised up if you reject the hand that reaches for you. This is why despair is deadly. It convinces the soul that it is beyond salvation. This is why presumption is deadly. It convinces the soul that it does not need salvation, and both lead to the same fatal outcome. A soul that dies without asking for God cannot awaken in his presence, because God forces no one. Never in human history has this sin been more widespread than now. Today, despair hides behind depression, trauma, and loneliness. Presumption hides behind self-help culture, moral relativism, and the notion that my truth is enough. People no longer go to confession, no longer examine their conscience, no longer feel the weight of moral responsibility. Everything is justified, everything is explained away, everything is reduced to psychology, sociology, or personal preference. But spiritual laws do not bend to human opinion, and the soul, even when ignored, continues to move toward eternity. The sin that kills repentance has become the spiritual epidemic of our time. And the warning of Saint Faustina, the warning we are unfolding now, is not a medieval relic. It is a message perfectly suited to modern humanity, a humanity that no longer sins in open rebellion, but in indifference. This section will map the psychological and spiritual mechanism step by step. How despair begins, how presumption grows, how a soul blinds itself, how conscience is suffocated, how hardness sets in. This is long and deep, so it will continue in the next block. You may think the most dangerous wars are the ones fought with weapons, but the truth is far more unsettling. The greatest battle you will ever face is the one fought inside your own heart. Not a battle of armies, but a battle of voices. One voice invites you to return to God, to rise again, to seek mercy, to trust. The other voice speaks quietly, almost gently. Don't bother. You're too far gone. You're not worthy. You're fine on your own. You don't need forgiveness. Maybe later. Maybe never. These whispers shape destinies. They mold eternity. And this is where Saint Faustina's warning becomes terrifyingly real. There is a sin, not one of action, but of attitude, that suffocates the desire to be saved. A sin that kills the will to turn back. A sin that seals the heart from the inside. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't look scandalous. It doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like indifference, like resignation, like pride disguised as peace. It looks like a soul saying, I don't need mercy, or mercy can't help me anymore. This is the sin that drags a soul to hell with terrifying speed, the refusal of God's mercy, through despair or presumption. And the world is drowning in both. But before we reach the conclusion, before we uncover the final piece of this spiritual tragedy, you must understand something crucial. No soul falls suddenly. Every fall begins with a tiny shift, a small lie, a subtle distortion, and those tiny lies grow just enough to push a soul away from the only love that could save it. Let's walk through the process, not with theory, but with truth. Step 1, the first compromise. It begins with a small sin, nothing dramatic, nothing shocking, just a moment when the soul says, I know this is wrong, but just this once. And instantly the enemy whispers, it wasn't that bad. The conscience protests, softly, gently. But the soul pushes it aside. That is the beginning. Step 2, the numbing of conscience. Repeat a sin often enough, and the heart stops reacting. The pain disappears. Not because the wound healed, but because the wound is now infected. The person begins to think, I don't feel guilty anymore. Maybe it's not a sin. This is exactly what the enemy wants, because a numb soul is easy to guide, quietly, slowly, toward destruction. Step 3, the pride that justifies everything. Once the conscience is silent, the soul begins to adopt a dangerous posture. God understands. I don't need to change. I know what's best for me. This is presumption, a false sense of spiritual security, and it is deadly, because a person who believes they don't need mercy never asks for it, and a person who never asks for mercy cannot receive it, not because God is unwilling, but because the door is locked from the inside. Step 4, the darkness of despair. For others, the lie goes in the opposite direction. Instead of pride, they fall into despair. God won't forgive me. I'm too dirty. I've sinned too much. It's too late. This is the enemy's masterpiece, not to make a soul sin, but to make a soul stop trying to return, until finally, the soul collapses into a single chilling thought. There is no reason to ask for mercy. And that is the moment, the fatal moment, when the most dangerous sin of all takes root. The decision to stop seeking God. Saint Faustina explained it simply. God forgives everything, absolutely everything, except the refusal to be forgiven. Not because he can't, not because he won't, but because mercy requires one thing, a heart willing to receive it. A soul refusing mercy chooses its own destiny. Hell is not a punishment forced upon the unwilling. Hell is the soul crying, I don't want you. And God, respecting human freedom, allows the soul to remain in the isolation it has chosen. This is why this sin condemns a soul quickly, because it leaves the soul with nowhere else to turn. You must understand a spiritual truth that very few people ever consider. At the moment of death, the soul becomes what it has chosen to be, not because God freezes it, but because death simply removes the distractions and illusions of this world. Who you truly are is fully revealed. A soul accustomed to asking for mercy will reach for it instinctively. A soul that refused mercy for years may no longer have the desire to return. This is why Saint Faustina trembled when she shared this warning, not because God is cruel, but because human hearts can become terrifyingly stubborn. Despite the gravity of this warning, there is a message of immense hope. No matter how numb your conscience has become, no matter how far you have drifted, no matter how cold your heart feels, one act can break everything open, a single whisper. Lord, have mercy on me. Help me. I want to return. I'm tired of being far from you. That whisper, even if weak, broken, hesitant, is enough to shatter despair, destroy presumption, and awaken the deadened soul. Because God's mercy is not fragile, it is not delicate, it is not limited. It is aggressive love, unstoppable love, unyielding love. The only thing it cannot do is force itself on a closed heart. But the moment the heart opens, even for an instant, mercy floods in. I need you to hear this carefully. If you are listening to this message today, it is not by accident. Maybe you've been drifting. Maybe you've been numb. Maybe you've been drowning in shame. Maybe you've been pretending everything is fine. Maybe this was the moment your soul needed to wake up. Not tomorrow, not someday, now. Your heart may feel far from God, but it is never too far, and the warning of Saint Faustina is not meant to terrify you. It is meant to save you, to keep you from becoming numb, to keep you from locking the door, to keep you from surrendering to despair or falling into pride. This is your moment of clarity, your moment of awakening, your moment of decision. Choose mercy, choose life, choose to begin again. Even a small opening is enough for God to begin His work in you. If this message touched you, if it awakened something inside your soul, if it made you reflect on your own path, then I invite you, from the bottom of my heart, to subscribe to this channel. Not for numbers, not for algorithms,